Clutter family were a family who lived in Holcomb, Kansas. Holcomb is and was a very small town of less than 300 people in 1959. The Clutters lived in a large farmhouse with 14 rooms. Bonnie Clutter, who was 45, was married to 48-year-old Herbert Clutter, and they had 4 kids. The family was very rich after Herbert made a machine to grow wheat. It became revolutionary, and eventually the New York Times interviewed him about his invention. Herbert and Bonnie had 2 kids who were adults, Beverly and Avenna. Their other 2 kids were Nancy and Kenyon. Nancy was 16 and she loved to bake, loved riding horses, and was dating a boy, Bob Rupp. Kenyon, who was 15, was skilled at woodworking around the house and the farm. While having a smaller build and poor eyesight, Kenyon was also good at basketball and baseball for his high school teams. Unfortunately, after her children were born, Bonnie battled crippling depression, which was so bad that it left her bedridden. However, Bonnie would sometimes participate in local garden clubs. Holcomb was a town where everyone knew each other, and the Clutters were an honorable family, and Herb was known as the salt of the earth. However, Holcomb being a small town, everyone knew that the Clutters were wealthy. Meanwhile, 300 miles away, Richard Hickok, who was 33 years old, cellmate at Kansas State Prison, had heard about the Clutters and their wealth from his cellmate, Floyd Wells. Wells had previously worked for the family on their farm and knew about their riches. Specifically, he told Richard that Herbert had a safe with $10,000 in it. Richard was in prison for theft. However, even being in prison, he planned on how he was going to rob the Clutters. After this, Richard wrote a letter to Perry Smith, who was a former cellmate. Perry was recently released from the prison and wanted to help Richard once he was released in November 1959. On November 14th, 4 of the family members were home, which was Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon. That night, Richard and Perry drove past the home and waited for the family to go to sleep. Before driving past the home, Richard and Perry got everything for the murder, which was a shotgun, flashlight, a knife, and gloves. Eventually, the family went to sleep. Luckily for the robbers, one of the doors to the house was unlocked. However, their entrance to the house woke up Herbert. After waking him up, the robbers ordered Herbert to tell them where the safe was. However, the robbers learned that Herbert didn't even own a safe. It turns out they were both misled. Herbert was always known to pay with a check instead of cash. However, this information didn't stop both of the robbers to go to each room and search for valuables. They only got a little bit of cash of $50, binoculars, and a transitor radio. The 2 robbers thought that Herbert was holding information about more cash or valuables, so they decided they would murder him and the other family members. The next day, 2 of Nancy's classmates, Susan Kidwell and Nancy Eatwalt, found the bodies. Eventually, when officers arrived, Herbert was discovered lying on a mattress in the basement with his mouth taped shut, stabbed, and a gunshot wound to his head. In the same room, Kenyon was also bound, gagged, and shot in the head. Bonnie and Nancy were found in separate rooms upstairs. Bonnie was bound and gagged, and Nancy was only bound. However, both of them had a gunshot wound to the head. Chief Mitchell Geisler and Assistant Chief Rich Rodletter were one of the first cops to arrive at the scene. Rich was also an excellent photographer and would document the scene with photos. Bloody footprints, which would be hard to see, would be discovered, which connected to Perry. Another photo revealed tire tracks of the vehicle leaving the scene. Alvin Dewey of the KBI would lead the investigation. There are also 4 other investigators working with him. Right after the murders, the 2 murderers would flee to the Kansas City area, which was around 6 hours away from Holcomb, which led to them fleeing to Mexico, where they would live for a brief period of time. They would sell the binoculars they stole at a pawn shop and hitchhike their way through California, all the way to Omaha, Nebraska. However, they would relocate to Iowa, where they would steal a car and return to Kansas City. However, after spending a short amount of time at Kansas City, they would travel to Florida and Nevada. They would get arrested on December 31st, 1959, after an over 6-week-long run from the police. The 2 were still driving the stolen car from Iowa when they were discovered. While they were on the run, the police were able to connect evidence together from Floyd Wells, who snitched on them for the murders. The shoe print would match up with the boots that the 2 had in their possession. Once they were captured, the KBI investigators flew out to Nevada, where the criminals would give a confession. After the confession, the 2 were flown out to Garden City, Kansas. A trial would be held at the Finney County District Court. The court decided on the 2 men being guilty of the murders and were given the death penalty. They were put on death row at the federal prison in Leavenworth, Kansas for 5 years. Eventually, on April 14th, 1965, the 2 men would be hanged. At 12:41 a.m., Richard would die, and at 1:19, Perry died. The 2 were buried at Mount Munchie Cemetery. Floyd Wells would later commit suicide in a cell in Mississippi.
Oh honey, I never felt